Mountaineers, hope you're having a great Saturday. So I'm getting ready to read chapters 3 and 4 to you of Pax, the story that we've been doing together. Remember in chapter 2, Peter has decided that he is going to go find Pax. So he left his grandfather's house because he's staying with his grandfather as his dad is off at war. But he misses Pax and he's got to find him. And he knows that his dad had a dog when he was growing up that he was inseparable, which means could not be separated from him. And so he loved him so much, and Peter knows that he feels the same way about Pax. So here's chapter 3, and I'll probably do chapter 4 too because they're a little shorter. Chapter 3. Pax was hungry and cold, but what had woken him was the sense that he needed cover. He blinked and edged backward. What felt like the comforting bars of his pen gave way in brittle snaps. He turned to find the stand of dried milkweed stalks he'd wedged himself against a few hours before. He barked for Peter and remembered. His boy was gone. Pax wasn't used to being alone. He had been born into a squirming litter of 4, but his father had disappeared before the kits had even learned his scent, and soon after that his mother had failed to come home one morning. One by one, his brothers and sisters had died, leaving his the only heartbeat in the cold den, until the boy, Peter, had lifted him out. Since that time, whenever his boy was gone, Pax would pace his pen until Peter returned, and at night he always whined to come inside, where he could listen to his human's breathing. Pax loved his boy, but more than that, he felt responsible for Peter, for protecting him. When he couldn't perform his role, he suffered. Pax shook the night's rain off his back and headed for the road without even stretching his stiff muscles, straining for his boy's scent. He couldn't find it. The night's winds had swept the ground clean of any trace, but among the hundreds of odors rising on the early morning breeze, he found something that reminded him of his boy. Acorns. Peter had often scooped up handfuls and sprinkled them over Pax's back, laughing to see him shake them off and then crack them to get at the meat. The familiar scent seemed a promise to him now, and he trotted toward it. The acorns were scattered around the base of a lightning-struck oak a few full bounds north of where he had last seen his boy. He crunched at a few of them, but found only shriveled, moldy nubs inside. Then he settled himself on the fallen trunk, ears trained for any sound on the road. While he waited, Pax licked his fur dry and clean, taking comfort in the lingering Peter scent he found there. Then he turned his attention to his forepaws, painstakingly cleaning the many cuts in their pads. Whenever he was anxious, Pax dug at the floor of his pen. He always shredded his paws on the rough concrete buried beneath, but he could not control the urge. In the week before, he dug nearly every day. When his paws were cleaned, he curled them up under his chest to wait. The morning air pulsed with the noises of spring. The long night before, they had alarmed Pax. The blackness had quivered with the rustle of night, prowlers, and even the sounds of the trees themselves, leaves unfurling, sap coursing up new wood, the tiny cracklings of expanding bark, had startled him over and over as he waited for Peter to return. Finally, as dawn had begun to silver the sky, he'd fallen into a shivering sleep. Now, though, the same sounds called to him. 100 times his sensitive ears pricked, and he almost sprang up to investigate. But each time he remembered his boy and stilled himself. The humans had good memories, so they would come back to this spot. But they relied on sight alone, all their other senses being so weak. So if they did not see him when they returned, they might leave again. Pax would stay beside the road and ignore all temptations, including the strong urge he felt to head south, the direction his instinct told him would lead him back to his home. He would stay at this spot until his boy came for him. Above him, a vulture cruised the thermals, a lazy hunter. It was searching for the lifeless shape of carrion. When it found the red-furred foam of the fox, motionless but giving off no odor of decay, it circled lower to investigate. Pax registered an instinctive alarm at the cool flicker of V-shaped shadow. He jumped from the trunk and scratched at the dirt beneath. The ground seemed to answer with a distant rumble like a growling heart. Pax stretched high, the danger from above forgotten. The last time he had seen his boy, there had been vibrations like this along this very road. He tore over the gravel shoulder to the exact spot where his humans had left him. The vibrations grew to a roar. Pax rose on his haunches to be seen, but the source was not his boy's car. It was not a car at all. As it loomed, it seemed to the fox to be as large as the house his humans lived in. The truck was green. Not the growing green of the trees all around, but a dull olive, a color death might wear when it claimed these trees. The same dull olive of the toy soldier the fox had catched in the milkweed stalks. It stank of diesel and small charred metal scent that had clung to his boy's favorite new clothing. In a cloud of dust and sprayed stone, the truck charged past, followed by another and another and another. Pax bounded away from the road. The vulture soared up and away with a single beat of its wings. So that was chapter 3. So Pax is looking to try to decide if he should stay and wait for Peter to come, or if he should start heading south as his instincts are telling him to do. So I'm going to read chapter 4 because it's another short one. Not hunting for his grandfather's flashlight, that was the first mistake of the trip. The moon had lit Peter's way for maybe 2 hours before it had drowned behind thick clouds. He'd stumbled along in the dark for another hour before giving up. He'd slit open the sides of a garbage bag to make a long mat and cut the other to wear as a poncho against the cold mist, and slept beside a culvert, his mitt for a pillow. Actually slept was a wild overstatement, and when the first low sun rays stabbed his eyelids, he'd awakened cold and wet from whatever dozing he'd managed. His first thoughts were of Pax. Where was he this morning? Was he wet and cold too? Was he afraid? "I'm coming," he said out loud as he rolled the garbage bags back into his pack. "Hold on." He ate a stick of cheese and a couple of crackers, slugged a long drink of water, then laced his boots and climbed up to the road. He was stiff and sore, but at least his anxiety had relaxed its grip. He probably hadn't traveled much more than 7 or 8 miles, but there was still a whole day before his grandfather would get home from work and even suspect he was gone. According to the atlas map, he probably had another 20 miles to go before hitting the highway. After that, he could turn west for the shortcut anywhere that looked promising. He'd sleep deep in woods tonight, out of civilization, the riskiest part of the trip behind him. He wished he'd paid more attention as he'd driven with his father the day before. Mistake number 2. But he'd only recalled there'd been a single sleepy town right after they'd exited the highway, and then stretches of woodlands broken only by occasional farms. Peter walked for 5 full hours. Blisters formed on his heels and his shoulders ached from the pack. But every step brought him closer to Pax and the home he should never have left, and he felt hopeful. Until a little after noon, when he hit a cluster of buildings that passed for a town square. Immediately, it seemed every person he passed was eyeing him suspiciously, wondering why he wasn't in the school he'd noticed a little while back. When a woman dragging a toddler stopped to stare outright, Peter pretended to study the window display in the hardware store beside him. In the glass, he saw his reflection, and the remnants of his hopeful mood melted. His hair was tangled with leaves, his sweatshirt streaked in mud, and his nose reddened with what promised to be a full-face sunburn by the end of the day. The kid in the window looked like a runaway, one who hadn't prepared very well. He sensed the woman moving on, but before he could leave, a shadow loomed over his shoulder. "Need something, young man?" Peter looked up. A man in a blue jacket with the store logo stood in the doorway, smoking. His arms were crossed over his sagging belly, and his hair was a thinning gray. But something about the way he was peering down his nose reminded Peter of a hawk he'd once seen searching for prey from the top of a cedar. He pointed to the window. Peter looked back at the display. Seed packets and gardening tools. "Oh no, I was just, do you sell flashlights?" The man cocked his head and eyed Peter while he took a drag on his cigarette, and again Peter was reminded of the hawk. Finally he nodded. "Aisle 7. No school today?" "Lunch break. Got to hurry back." The man stubbed out his cigarette and followed him inside, hovering nearby while Peter chose the cheapest flashlight on the rack and a pack of double A's, and even shadowed him as he checked out. Outside, Peter let out the breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. He wedged everything into his pack and headed back for the intersection. "Hey, kid!" Peter froze. The man had followed him outside. He yanked a thumb over his shoulder. "School's that way." Peter waved and smiled, trying to act dopey, and changed direction. At the corner, he risked a glance over his shoulder. The man was still watching him. Peter took off, sudden trickles of sweat chilling the back of his neck. He didn't stop running until he reached the school entrance, then cut for the parking lot. All he wanted to do was hide for a couple of minutes, maybe crouch between a couple of pickups and figure out an escape route. But beyond the parking lot and the utility buildings, he saw something a whole lot more appealing. A baseball diamond carved into the lime green spring grass and tucked along the third base line, facing away from the school, an empty dugout. Peter stood at the top of the rise looking down at the sight. He argued with himself for only a minute. He'd like to be moving, for sure, making time. But what if that guy had called the police? Hitting the road would be risky. Any time he rested, he could easily make up at night, since he had a flashlight now. And he was suddenly tired, bone-dead tired. Mostly, though, it was the way the field looked so welcoming, as if it were inviting him in. Peter always felt good on a baseball field. And maybe that was a sign. He didn't think he believed in signs, but after the Coyotes last night, he wasn't sure he didn't. Peter adjusted his backpack and loped down the hill. In the dugout, the familiar mingled sense of leather, sweat, and stale bubblegum wrapped around him like a hug. Peter hurried into his other set of clothes and rubbed a handful of clay red dirt through his hair. When he left here, he sure wasn't going to look like any description the police might have. He filled his thermos from a water fountain, drank it all down, and filled it again. As he wiggled back under the bench, he smiled, realizing that Pax would have chosen this same spot, protected but with a good vantage point, if he wanted a rest. An hour, that was all, and then he'd cut behind the school and pick up the road again. Enough time that if the police had been called, they would lose interest. He arranged his baseball glove and lowered his head. Just an hour, he murmured. I won't even close my eyes. And that's the end of chapter 4. So I also want you to notice that the story goes back between two different points of view. The point of view of Peter and then the point of view of Pax. So we're hearing both of their stories at the same time and learning what each one is going through to get back to the other. So as we read, I want you to continue to think about that and continue to think about how different the stories sound when Pax is telling it versus when Peter is telling it, and what that might say to you about how each one is dealing with their time away from one another. Okay, have a good rest of the day. I hope you enjoy the sunshine, and I'll be back with chapter 5 soon. I miss you all so much.